Back in the 80s, life looked and felt remarkably different. The things people did every day, the gadgets they relied on, and the habits they took for granted have all but vanished. Looking back at that world can offer a fresh perspective on just how much has changed. Television and the antenna ritual. The way people watched television was an experience in itself. Rabbit ears sat on top of the set, and getting a clear picture meant fiddling with those thin metal prongs, repositioning them, spreading them apart, angling them toward the wall, sometimes wrapping a strip of aluminum foil around them to coax a sharper signal. Households determined to get the best possible reception would mount a large antenna on the roof, a visible badge of how seriously they took their viewing. For anyone who wanted to watch a movie at home, there was the RF modulator, a small box that bridged the VCR and the television. It was an essential piece of equipment, though the whole process of connecting everything and tuning to the right channel feels almost comically involved compared to pulling up a film with a single tap today. The televisions themselves were massive wooden-framed consoles, heavy enough to anchor a room. When the picture went fuzzy, the accepted solution was to give the side of the set a firm slap. No one could explain exactly why this worked, but it often did, and the moment the image snapped back into focus carried its own quiet satisfaction. Those bulky sets are a far cry from the thin, wall-mounted screens of today, and the journey from rabbit ears to high-definition streaming represents one of the more dramatic shifts in everyday domestic life. Smoke in the air, everywhere. Cigarette smoke was simply part of the atmosphere in the early 1980s. Restaurants, grocery stores, offices, and commercial airplanes all carried a permanent haze. Passengers boarding a flight would find small ashtrays built directly into the armrests of their seats. Even the cockpit was not off limits. Pilots could light up at 30,000 feet, and nobody thought much of it. The general attitude was that a pilot struggling with nicotine withdrawal was a greater risk than the smoke itself. That outlook reflected a genuinely different understanding of what tobacco did to the human body. Over time, research made the dangers of secondhand smoke impossible to ignore. Public health campaigns reshaped attitudes, and gradually the laws followed. Designated outdoor smoking areas replaced the haze indoors, and the transformation, while difficult for many who had grown up lighting up freely, demonstrated how profoundly scientific evidence can shift social behavior. The smoke-filled cabin of an 80s airliner now seems like something from another world entirely. Faces on milk cartons. Milk itself looked different in that era. It came in cardboard half-gallon cartons rather than plastic jugs, and soy, almond, or oat alternatives simply did not exist. What made those cartons truly distinctive, however, was what was printed on their sides. Black and white photographs of missing children appeared on millions of cartons, accompanied by basic identifying information and the words, "Have you seen me?" Children eating breakfast would find themselves looking at those faces every morning. It was an unusual and sometimes unsettling way to confront a serious issue, but it kept the subject of missing children present in everyday life at a time when the internet and social media did not exist to spread information quickly. Whether the approach was effective is a matter of debate, but the intention was clear. Use the most widely distributed, most commonly seen surface available to reach as many people as possible. Today, Amber Alerts and digital platforms have replaced the milk carton, but the image of those small photographs on a cardboard container remains one of the more striking symbols of the era. Leaded fuel and the 55-mile-per-hour limit. Gas stations of the 80s operated differently as well. Full service stations were common, meaning an attendant would come to the car, pump the fuel, check the oil, and clean the windshield. Self-service has since become the default almost everywhere, a reflection of how much the pace and character of daily life has changed. The fuel itself was also different. Leaded gasoline was still available and widely used, and prices were low enough that filling up a large car cost less than $10. Lead was eventually removed from gasoline after research confirmed its serious effects on human health and the surrounding environment. The switch to unleaded fuel was one of the more consequential public health decisions of the 20th century. On the roads, a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour applied to highways and interstates. It had originally been introduced during the 1970s as a way to conserve fuel, but drivers found it frustrating. The limit was lifted, and higher speeds were permitted again in the 1980s and 90s, though the debate over safety and fuel consumption continued long after. Saturday mornings and the TV guide. For children in the 1980s, Saturday morning was sacred. The weekly ritual began the moment the eyes opened. Cereal, pajamas, and the television set to whatever animated series was at the top of the schedule. The lineup of cartoons that filled those hours was something children planned for and looked forward to all week. Planning required a TV guide. That small printed booklet was a household staple. Families would page through it, circling the shows they wanted to watch and mapping out their viewing schedule for the week. If a VCR was not available, and in the early part of the decade many households did not have one, missing a show meant missing it entirely. There was no catching up later. That finality made every episode feel more significant, and it made the conversations about favorite shows at school on Monday morning feel genuinely important. Shared viewing experiences created a kind of common ground that on-demand streaming, for all its convenience, tends to dissolve. The rotary phone and the address book. The telephone was a different kind of object. Rotary phones required deliberate physical engagement. Each digit had to be dialed in sequence, the finger placed in the appropriate hole and turned all the way around until it reached the stop, then released and allowed to return before dialing the next number. There was a particular clicking sound to it, and the whole process had a rhythm. The cord attached to the handset developed a life of its own over time, coiling and tangling until it became nearly impossible to stretch to a comfortable length. Untangling that cord was a routine domestic task. Because phones had no built-in contact lists, people maintained address books and memorized the numbers they called most often. The move to push-button phones made dialing faster. Cordless phones allowed movement around the house. And then mobile phones arrived and changed everything, absorbing the address book, the calendar, the alarm clock, and the camera all at once. The rotary phone now exists mainly as a decorative object, but it represents a time when a phone call demanded a certain amount of attention and intentionality. The morning newspaper. In most households, the day began with the thud of a newspaper landing on the front step. The paper was the primary source of news, and the Sunday edition was an event in itself. It arrived thick and heavy, filled with national and local reporting, opinion columns, sales circulars, coupons, and the comics section. Families would spread the sections across the table and pass them around. The coupons were clipped, the ads studied, the crossword attempted. For children, delivering newspapers was often a first job. Riding through the neighborhood before dawn, folding and tossing papers onto porches, collecting payment from subscribers at the end of the week, it was a genuine introduction to responsibility and the satisfaction of earning money. The digital age has eroded the print newspaper significantly. Online sources and social media now deliver news faster and more continuously than any printed edition could. The experience of holding a broadsheet, smelling the ink, and reading at whatever pace felt comfortable was different in character from scrolling a feed, and for many people, it still carries a powerful sense of nostalgia. The Space Shuttle and the Dream of Orbit. Space exploration held an almost mythological quality for children in the 1980s. The Space Shuttle was the symbol of that era, a vehicle that launched like a rocket and returned like an airplane, capable of carrying ordinary-seeming human beings into orbit. The program made space feel closer and more attainable than it ever had before. That sense of possibility intensified when Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from New Hampshire, was selected to fly aboard the Challenger. Her selection sent a message that space travel was opening up beyond the boundaries of career astronauts and military test pilots. Then, in January of 1986, the Challenger broke apart shortly after launch, killing all 7 crew members, including McAuliffe. The disaster was witnessed live by millions, many of them children watching from school classrooms. The grief and shock that followed were profound and lasting. The shuttle program continued for another 25 years, achieving remarkable things before its final flight in 2011. The legacy of those missions, the science conducted, the technology developed, and the inspiration generated continues to shape human spaceflight today, including the push toward Mars and the rise of commercial space companies. Chickenpox by invitation. Before a vaccine existed, chickenpox was treated as an unavoidable childhood event, something to get through and move past. The common wisdom held that younger children tended to have milder cases, while the illness became more dangerous in adults. Acting on that logic, parents in the 1970s and into the early 80s would arrange for their healthy children to spend time with a child who was actively sick with chickenpox. The goal was deliberate infection at an age when the symptoms would presumably be manageable, so that the child would carry immunity going forward. These gatherings were informal and practical in intent. Parents brought their children over, the kids played together, and the virus did what viruses do. The risks were real, since some children did develop serious cases, but the practice reflected the options available at the time and a genuine effort to protect children from a worse outcome later. The chickenpox vaccine, introduced in the 1990s, made the entire calculation irrelevant. The disease became preventable rather than merely manageable, and chickenpox parties became a historical curiosity, the lost art of being bored. Children in the early 80s had no screens to stare at outside the home. Car trips, waiting rooms, grocery store visits, all of those stretches of time were simply empty. There was no device to reach for, no game to open, no video to watch. Children looked out windows, made up games, talked, daydreamed, and waited. Doctors' offices and dentist waiting rooms had magazines, often months old, the puzzles already filled in by previous visitors. Background music played from speakers in the ceiling. There was nowhere to retreat to and nothing to scroll through. That kind of unstructured time, which felt like an imposition in the moment, turns out to have had its uses. Boredom pushed children toward imagination. It required them to generate their own entertainment, to sit with their own thoughts, to develop patience and the capacity for self-directed play. The comparison with today's constant availability of stimulation raises genuine questions about what children gain and lose in each arrangement. Carpet fresh, potpourri, and decorative soap. Keeping a home smelling pleasant in the 80s involved a specific set of tools and rituals. Carpet fresh, a powder sprinkled over rugs before vacuuming, was supposed to neutralize odors and leave behind a fresh scent. The vacuum bags of that era would sometimes burst, sending a cloud of dust and stale air into the room, which made the pre-treatment feel all the more necessary. Potpourri sat in decorative ceramic bowls and wicker baskets throughout the house, releasing the scent of dried flowers and spices. Warmers designed to heat the mixture and intensify the fragrance were also widely used, though they left a sticky residue that required regular scrubbing. Incense was burned frequently, particularly in households where cigarette smoke was common. And then there were the decorative soaps. These were small, carefully shaped objects, carved or molded into flowers, shells, animals, and other ornamental forms, displayed in dishes on bathroom counters and windowsills. They were not to be used. Using them would have been almost transgressive. They existed purely to be looked at and, to a lesser extent, smelled. The unspoken rule surrounding these soaps captured something genuine about the aesthetics of the decade, an era that placed considerable value on presentation and the appearance of refinement. The console television, the TV tray, and the clapper. Walking into a living room in the 1980s meant encountering a specific arrangement of furniture and technology. The wooden console television anchored the room. It was enormous, heavy enough to require multiple people to move, and it functioned as a piece of furniture as much as an appliance. The television was the center of the household's shared life, and the room was often organized around it. Metal TV trays served a practical function in that arrangement. Foldable and lightweight, they could be set up quickly in front of the sofa to hold a plate and a drink during dinner, then folded away again when the meal was done. Some households stored them under the couch. Others kept a dedicated rack for them, a piece of storage furniture that existed solely to organize the TV trays. The clapper occupied a strange position in the technology landscape of that era. Heavily advertised on television, it allowed users to turn lights and appliances on and off by clapping their hands twice in succession. The device inspired considerable mockery and became a recurring subject of jokes. But it also represented something people genuinely found appealing, the idea that a simple physical gesture could control the environment around you. It was a small, somewhat absurd preview of what home automation would eventually become: brass, ceramics, and hand-painted figurines. Brass was everywhere in 80s homes. Lamps, picture frames, candlestick holders, cabinet hardware, decorative figurines, all of it in polished metal that caught the light and suggested a certain kind of formal elegance. Maintaining that appearance required regular attention. Specialized polishes, soft cloths, and considerable effort were needed to keep tarnish from dulling the surface. Brass polishing was a routine household chore. Ceramic animals and decorative figurines occupied shelves, mantels, and side tables throughout the house. A popular variation on this trend was purchasing blank, undecorated ceramic pieces and painting them at home. Paint-your-own ceramic sets were widely available, and the results, ranging from skillful to cheerfully imperfect, would then be displayed proudly in the living room. The practice combined a domestic craft tradition with a desire to personalize mass-produced objects. The finished pieces carried a meaning that a store-bought decoration could not quite replicate because they carried the visible evidence of the maker's own hands. Ding-dongs and ShowBiz Pizza. Certain treats and venues defined the experience of being a child in that decade. Hostess ding-dongs arrived individually wrapped in foil, and the unwrapping was part of the ritual. The chocolate coating, the cream filling, the specific density of the cake itself, all of it added up to something that felt genuinely special in the way that a simple packaged snack could in an era with fewer options and less constant access to food. ShowBiz Pizza was a destination. Families would go there for birthday parties and weekend outings, drawn by the arcade games, the pizza, and the animatronic entertainment that played on a small stage. Gameplay earned tokens or tickets, and those tickets could be exchanged for prizes at the redemption counter. The prizes were often modest: a plastic ring, a small toy, a piece of candy. But the process of earning and choosing carried a satisfaction that made the whole experience feel rewarding. Erasable pens, the epilady, and 1-800 numbers. Not every innovation of the era lived up to its promise. Erasable pens were marketed as a revolutionary solution for anyone who made mistakes in ink. In practice, the ink was difficult to remove cleanly, often smearing across the page or leaving a ghost of the original mark behind. The paper could be damaged by the friction required to erase. The product solved a problem less effectively than a pencil had for centuries. The Epilady was an electric hair removal device that promised smooth results without shaving. Women who bought it found that it worked, but at a cost. The mechanism pulled hair from the root, which was painful, and the aftermath sometimes included ingrown hairs and skin irritation. The gap between the marketing and the experience was substantial. Children watching cartoons in the early '80s regularly encountered commercials for 1-800 numbers that promised to connect them directly with their favorite animated characters. The advertisements usually included a disclaimer advising children to ask a parent before calling, but the disclaimer was easy to miss and easier to ignore. Parents discovered the calls when the phone bill arrived, listing charges for conversations the children had made without permission. The episode illustrated something broader about the advertising culture of that decade, a willingness to market directly to children in ways that placed the burden of oversight entirely on parents. Each of these details, taken individually, might seem minor. Taken together, they form a portrait of a particular moment in domestic and cultural life, one that is recent enough to be remembered clearly, but distant enough to feel genuinely different from the present. The technologies, habits, and assumptions of the 1980s reflect how people understood their world at the time, and how quickly that understanding can shift.